called for there to be a White House conference on the eradication of poverty. We need to come together, make this a priority, and then acknowledge we just need massive jobs with a living wage.
I'm sitting here with the distinguished Cornel West and Tavis Smiley, who have just published their book, The Rich and the Rest of Us, which is an outgrowth of their 18-city poverty tour last summer, where they have been all over the country listening to and hearing stories about what Americans are going through right now in this economic downturn. And this book really is a kind of report, in a sense, isn't it? And an echo of everything that you saw. So, Cornel, how did this idea start? How did it begin?
This dear brother right here came up with the idea of a poverty tour right in my mother's living room, and I said my only precondition is that we begin at an Indian reservation to focus on our precious indigenous brothers and sisters. He said yes, and of course the Smiley group kicked in. Next thing you know, we had 18 cities set. Black, white, red, yellow, poor people across the board. So we're going to make sure that poverty becomes a central issue, not just in election, but in public discourse across the nation.
What have you learned, Tavis, that you didn't expect to hear? I mean, obviously, you've both been such keen, observers, writers, thinkers, lobbyists, in a sense, on behalf of the poor. But what have you learned from this actual physical trip, that you didn't know before?
There's nothing quite like getting out of the studio to go see face-to-face what people are dealing with on a regular basis. And so I always revel in the chance just to get it from behind the desk and get out amongst people. And when you get out to talk to people about the poverty they're wrestling with, a few things come out, Tina. Number one, in no particular order, it's much worse than the numbers suggest. It's hard to take the government numbers too seriously because they don't report people who have stopped looking for work, and those numbers can't give any sense of the misery and the social decay and the hopelessness and the helplessness and the struggle with dignity that poor people are faced when they don't have an opportunity to use their God-given talent to make some kind of contribution. So the numbers can't really tell that story, number one, but you have to be up close and personal to see, to feel, and to touch that. Secondly, there's been an assumption in this country for years that poverty is color-coded. So you think poverty, you think what, black or brown? That's not the case. Americans of all races, all colors, and all creeds are now struggling with poverty. When you have 1 out of 2 Americans who are either in or near poverty, the perennially poor, the new poor that we call the former middle class, and the near poor, that's 150 million Americans. And so it can't just be a black or brown issue anymore. It's a societal crisis. So it's not what we think of when we think of poverty, number two. And number three, the poverty is so dire at this point that a slight uptick in our economy, we are convinced and argue in the text, that a slight uptick in our economy is not going to solve the poverty crisis in this country. So we learned a great deal.
So what are the big things that you're advocating in this book?
Well, one, we call for there to be a White House conference on the eradication of poverty. All the best minds, including voices of the poor themselves, trade union movement, a host of others, feminist movement, anti-homophobic movement, we need to come together, make this a priority, and then acknowledge we just need massive jobs with a living wage, mortgage relief, and building on the Occupy movement, a serious discussion about wealth inequality.
Now, of the stories that you heard, what was a story that had tremendous impact on you or changed your thinking?
Well, Tent City, I think, hit me more than anything else. Tent City, right outside of Ann Arbor, where you've got working poor people who can't find a job with a living wage, nor could find housing, and were often referred to the Tent City. They live outside. Some have been there for years, and you get to walk for.
So what are people doing when you say they've given up looking for jobs? I mean, what are they actually living on?
Well, they're living on friends.
They're living on friends.
Yeah, sometimes a spouse.
That's why the Tent City story is so powerful, because we have a municipal agency in Ann Arbor that is there's such a dearth and paucity of their own resources that they end up referring people who come to an official government entity. They end up referring them to what is essentially an illegal tent city under a bunch of freeway overpasses in Ann Arbor, because it's not legal to just set up and live and just camp out in these areas. But when government is now recommending to everyday people to go to an illegal setup, so they can survive and live. And there are 48 families in this tent city, so it was moving for us to see people. And as you know, in Ann Arbor, it gets cold in the wintertime. So we were there last summer. How these folk were going to survive in the winter? Thankfully, in Michigan, the winter wasn't so bad this year, but that moved us. We were also in Akron, Ohio, and in Akron, we spent some time with a room full of military veterans one night. And it just breaks your heart to look at persons who put their lives on the line to protect our freedoms in this country. And they come back home, and 1, 2, 3, 4 years, they can't find gainful employment. If we do that to military vets, then you start to understand how it is and why it is that the fastest growing group of persons falling into poverty in this country. I saw and watched so much of your brilliant, wonderful women's forum here in New York not long ago. But something is wrong with the nation, Tina, where its women and children are falling faster into poverty than any other group in the country. Something is wrong. When the younger you are in America, the more likely you are to be poor. And so in this debate right now in the campaign about women and the war on women and Ann Romney and going to work or staying home, that's all a bunch of nonsense on a certain level. What really matters here, which Mr. Romney and Mr. Obama are not talking about, is why women and children are falling faster into poverty than anybody else in this country.